Okay. Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. What a great turnout. Amazing. So tonight, an evening of ghost tales from the Isle of Wight. What are we going to go through tonight? I can find my mouse pointer. Where is it? Only somewhere. There we are. Right, we'll have an introduction. And then we're going to talk about Bloodstone Copses. Who knows about Bloodstone Copses? Yeah. We're going to talk about Alwin the Lame. Who's heard that story? Thank goodness. Who knows about the Shalfleet hanging tree? Yes. would you like to take over? The creature of Blackwater Hollow. The Spectre of St Mildred's. The Gatten Horse. I kind of phoned that last one in. It was getting late. And then we'll take some questions if we have time. So some of you will know who I am. Some of you who don't know. Just a little introduction. My name's Paul Wilson. I am a doctor in history. I specialise in the early medieval and the pre-Christian to Christian transfer. I was born on the Isle of Wight, and then we moved away, and then we came back, and we moved away and came back, and it's kind of been. And then I moved away, and then eventually came back with my family, and since then, I've been sort of gathering up all the stories that my grandparents told me and my parents told me, and trying to lock down some of this oral tradition that seems to float away. And in around about 2015, earlier than that, 2010, I decided to give away my day job, and I became a professional writer and artist and storyteller, and eventually folklorist. And that's why we're here tonight. So I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a short little poem. One Need Not Be a Chamber to Be Haunted by Emily Dickinson. I love this. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, that its interior confronting that cooler host. Far safer, though, an abbey gallop, the stones a chase, the unarmed one, a self-encounter in lonesome place. Ourself behind while selves concealed should startle most, assassin hid in our apartment, be horror's least. The body burrows a revolver, he bolts the door, overlooking a superior spectre. Or more. I think that's just beautiful language. Although that might set the scene for tonight. I could only hope to write like that. So what we're going to talk about, let's start off with a little bit of what are ghosts? And this time of year, what is it that attracts us to scary stories and huddling around telling these tales? Who knows about Halloween? Yeah? Yeah? All heard about Halloween? Where kids run around and try and get sweets from you? Trick or treat? Well, Halloween is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. That's kind of the night before it all really kicks off. Who knows about the Allhallowtide? The Allhallowtide is the real celebration. So what has kind of happened over the last century or so is these celebrations that were held over 3 days were kind of squished down into one little sanitized thing that became commercialized, and we kind of let go of it in the 18th century, 19th century, but you know our American cousins sort of kept up with it in their own special way, and then we brought it back And we kind of lost what it was all about. So, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, that's what it is. So the eve before All Hallow Mass, or All Hallows Day. And tonight is the last night of Allhallowtide, All Souls. And our Latin American friends might call the Day of the Dead. So each of these days had a special meaning and it was a continual celebration. All Hallows Eve was where everyone prepared all sorts of treats, cakes and all sorts of things. The All Hallow Mass was where we celebrated the saints and those unattested and local saints and holy people. But the real fun is tonight. All Hallows, All Souls, I should say, All Souls. Because this is the night when what they called the poor souls would walk the earth. Those souls that had not attained and gone to heaven. Those souls that hung around in purgatory. Or those that didn't even make it to purgatory. They used to say that tonight is when those walls between what was an unbreakable fence or guardrail between the two realms, it just sort of opened slightly. So we could see what was going on, and they can see what's going on here. So that's why tonight we're going to have ghost stories, because tonight is the night when we should be celebrating them. So what are ghosts? Anyone have an idea? Any ideas? No?
Supposedly the dead spirit, when people die, their spirit is a separate thing, and some
It hasn't gone up to heaven.
some disappear and
Maybe.
others linger around.
Yeah, possibly. Or maybe it's a memory or an echo of something that has happened. Maybe the shades of the past, those footsteps of generations that have walked these roads and these alleyways and these paths.
I think it depends on your own experience, what you've had.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Really, to have a bias.
I think tonight's not about answering those questions, a bit more about asking those questions, I think. And I think that's the fun in it, not knowing. And the appearance of ghosts and spectres and ghouls and apparitions seems to have become something that has ramped up over the centuries. When you look back in the early medieval period and even in the ancient world, kind of the idea of ghosts was, yeah, there was an idea of it, but pretty far and few between. The visitation maybe here and there. And then through the sort of early medieval pagan period again, maybe visitations of spirits and things, but hauntings. There were things like malevolent spirits, maybe angry spirits. You could probably class those as hauntings. And then Christianity came along. You still had the same sort of thing in the medieval period. It wasn't until Reformation that things started to really pick up with ghosts. Why is that? Why is it that when Western Europe became more Protestant, did this happen? Well, I think, and this is my theory, until that point, the idea of ancestor veneration or worship was prevalent. The Catholic Church was encouraged it. You prayed to your ancestors so that they would intercede for you in heaven. The Anglo-Saxons, pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons, They venerated their ancestors. The ancient peoples did the same. Maybe we lost something in that transition and we forgot to venerate our ancestors, so they hung around just trying to poke and prod and remind us. I don't know. I don't have the answer. But they say that the Isle of Wight is the most haunted place in Britain. They say you can't go round a corner without meeting a spectre or a ghost. Why does this little island attract such paranormal activity? Is it because it's a small, self-contained little thing? Is it because there is magic in the earth? As I said earlier, how many generations of people have walked these paths? How many people have lived and died, told stories, created magic, enchantments, worshipped, prayed, baptized, died, prayed to the gods, prayed to a god. Maybe that's it, I don't know. The Isle of Wight has a tendency to hang on to things though, doesn't it? We like to hang on to things. We were the last place in Britain to hang on to paganism. And even then, when Catholicism came, we kind of ignored it a little bit. And we melded it in, and even our old churches were testaments to the old gods. And then Reformation came. Henry VIII decided he was going to marry some pretty young thing, ditch his wife, didn't he? How did he do that? He broke from the church, broke from the mother church. Protestantism came. And what did the Isle of Wight do? We kind of hung on to Catholicism. We went with the flow, but we kind of didn't. So we just hang on to things all the time. We try to hang on to the things that we know. And that's maybe why the ghosts hang around, because they just want to hang around, right? They like it here. I don't have the answers. So tonight we're going to have these stories, and I preface every talk that I do. Some of you will have been to them, some of you won't. I always say that nothing is made up, just remembered differently. So as we go through these stories tonight, you may have a decision to make. Is it real or is it not? And I like to say it's either everything is real or nothing. So I always go with the side of magic. Bloodstone Copses. Now the simple story is, for those of you that don't know, there is a place called Bloodstone Copses. There's a little stream that runs through. There's a spring. And the water and the rocks are a reddish colour. And the simple story is that it is the blood of the Danes from a Viking battle. But that's not the full story. And we're going to do these stories that I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through in order of when they happened. So tonight, this is our earliest story. We're going to go back to 994. King Ethelred the Unready. Who's heard of King Ethelred the Unready? Well, his name really wasn't Unready. It was actually Unred, which meant bad counsel, which was a bit of a play on his name, because Ethelred actually meant good counsel. But he had some pretty bad advisors and he made some pretty bad mistakes. Or so the story goes. 994. King Olaf of Norway has just left England after Ethelred had been convinced to pay him £22,000 in gold and jewels. King Olaf left, promising to never return. But some of the Vikings, some of his men decided to stay. They liked it here. And they decided to stay here on the Isle of Wight as mercenaries, as paid mercenaries. So, from the early 10th century, the late 10th century, we had these Vikings who had come to the Isle of Wight. Now, the people of the Isle of Wight kind of held a grudge, as we've talked about. They still didn't quite like the Saxons. They were Jutish, or Utes. They were the proud Utes people. So having these Vikings who kind of didn't like the Saxons either, I was kind of okay with them. They kind of went with the flow, the people of the Isle of Wight, or the Witwater. But deep down, they really didn't like the Saxons. Then, in 1001, it's the mere 6 years later, the Danish fleet attacked Sussex. And then they came to the Isle of Wight. And they say that the Wit people, the Witwater, kind of let them in because they set up a base here. And they liked it here because they could stay here whenever they couldn't go. And this is their words, when their Norman brothers were too noisy. So when the Normans were too noisy for the Vikings, they'd come and stay here. And then they'd go and raid around the coast. They went as far as Devon and were pushed back at that point. But they kept coming back until finally, later in the next year, King Aelfred had enough. He had enough of these Vikings. So he decreed on the 13th of November, 1002, St. Brice's Day, and this is called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. He decreed that all Danes in England would be killed, murdered, wiped off the face of the earth. And that's what people did. Do you know which place didn't do that? The Isle of Wight. Now, it was a bit of a blunder move by Aelfred. He accidentally killed a woman called Gundhild, the sister of Sven Forkbeard, the Danish king. News got back to Forkbeard, and he started sending raiding parties again. Then, in 1013, when Forkbeard thought that he had pushed down the English forces as best he could, he attacked because he wanted the kingdom of England, not only for its riches, but also for revenge for killing his sister. Aelfred fled. And in another unbelievably stupid move, where do you think he went? Any ideas? The Isle of Wight. And hence, we get to our story. He came to the Isle of Wight, intent on laying low, and found that there was a big horde of Vikings. And so, the very last battle between Ethelred and the Vikings happened here at Bloodstone Copses. Now there were heavy casualties each side, and Ethelred knew that it was touch and go. He didn't have the full might of his army, and the Vikings, they were just mental, they were crazy. So he reached out to the Blackwater and he said, look, if I reinstigate or re-establish self-governance, give you your own lord back, will you fight on my side? And the islanders did. They defeated the forces. Ethelred went into exile, was able to get over to France, and the Isle of Wight was kind of left to its own devices. But to this day, the water runs red. And they say if you go and if you go there and camp, the early morning, on a summer's early morning, you know those awful muggy mornings that we have where it's grey and it's hot and sticky. They say that on those mornings, you can still hear the clashes of the swords and the calling out of men as their bones break and they bleed to death in the spring water. And that's the full story of Bloodstone Copses.
Where is it?
I will take questions at the end. Alwin the Lame. I love this story. Or the Knight of Five Barrows. So the story goes that the Lord of Carisbrooke invited his kith and kin from all around the Saxon kingdoms, and also the descendants of the Utis from Canterbury and the Meonwara. And he invited them to a great feast on the island with the intention of having a night of storytelling. I'm going to open this door. It's getting a bit warm in here. There you go. That beeping is what's annoying me, you see. But I'm sure we'll cope. So a night of storytelling and drinking and probably womanizing and eating and having a wonderful rip-roaring time. Probably some fights and all that sort of stuff. And the night went on. The men, the lords, told their stories. Oh, and I forgot to say that the Lord of Carisbrooke, whose name is now lost to time, said, bring your champions, because they deserve this too, because they're the stars of these stories. So the lords told their stories, and their champions told their stories. Each story getting more and more elaborate and bigger and trying to top the other. And they had people from, as I said, from all of southern England. And they had one particular person, Leofwine Godwinson. Does anyone know the name Godwinson? Yeah. Earl of Kent and brother of Harold, King Harold Godwinson. And as the night grew on, he'd been quite quiet, sitting there with a large gentleman beside him. And it became boisterous and rowdy, and the songs they sung, and the tales they told, and the ale they drank, and the food they ate. Then as the night went on, as these things do, things started to quieten down a little bit as everyone got a little bit drunk, or a lot, and got tired. And Llywelyn stood up and he said, here is my champion, Alwin, the greatest champion in all the kingdoms. He has never been defeated. He has never been pushed off his horse. And he told stories, great stories, stories of battling enemies, of slaying animals, of bringing back the biggest, most fearsome boars, and the stories of his conquests are second to none. And the Lord of Carisbrooke sat there, and his mood had been growing darker and darker as the night went on. And Llywelyn said, my lord, this is supposed to be a celebration. What is the problem? And the Lord of Carisbrooke says, I must tell you the truth. I kind of brought you here under false pretenses. There is a dreadful apparition that haunts my land. Over the other side, in the barren part, the most desolate part, the quietest part, atop a hill near a crooked path, where they say the ancient kings of the island once resided, there is a dreadful apparition. He guards this place, and no man can get past. Any man I send there never returns. None of us have had the courage to go and even see. All we have heard is the stories that have come back from the survivors. And those survivors are the pages of my housecarl, or what we would call knights now. And Llywelyn said, fear not, my lord. Alwin, who's never been defeated, a man of few words, but strength beyond strength. He'll go, and he'll defeat this creature, this monster, for you. And so the next day, Alwin, with his page, set off, and they travel to what we now call Five Barrows. Does everyone know where Five Barrows is?
No.
It's over the west of the island. And you're going round to Freshwater Bay, and there's the barrows up on top of the hill. There's
all the burials are, isn't it?
the burial mounds, yeah, and the remains of a Saxon settlement there. And so they rode, and they reached there within the hour. They walked up the crooked path. Now this is a very special path. It's one of the oldest chalk paths in the country, one of the most ancient and well-travelled paths in this entire country. There's been artifacts that have been found there that go back to the Iron Age. So they walked up the hill. They walked around the monuments, the ruins of what was a settlement, the burial mounds. They walked around them, but nothing. The sun came up, and still nothing. The page said to Alwin, "My lord, let us go. There's nothing going to happen. They've been playing a joke on us. Nothing will happen." But Alwin had sworn that he would defeat this spectre. And as the sun went over and started to set in the west, looking out over what is now Culver Bay and Freshwater Bay. Not Culver Bay, I meant, sorry, Culver's the other side, isn't it? You know what I'm talking about. Freshwater Bay went down. They sat down and decided to make camp for the evening. They found a bit of shelter in part of the old castle there. They had some food. And then they heard a noise. Alwin's horse became agitated and looked around, whinnied. They tied their horse tighter, and then they heard hooves coming in the distance, full pelt, galloping. And then they heard a strange voice in a very thick old accent. "Who disturbs my kingdom?" Alwin stood, sword at the ready. A man, nothing more than a man as far as Alwin could see, stood before him, sitting before him on this great horse. "Who disturbs my kingdom?" Alwin said nothing, drew his sword and stood his ground. The man on the horse, who now Alwin could see had eyes of fire. The horse, his nostrils breathing steam. And this man, who he thought was a man, had a great gash down his side. Bloodied hand, war-weary. The man took his sword and they clashed. Alwin taking every blow as the spectre hit him from side to side to side to side, knocking him to the ground, and Alwin would get back up. The spectre hitting him, showing no signs of tiredness. Alwin taking a beating over and over, getting battled back, but getting up every time he was knocked down, till finally the great knight hit Alwin in the side of the head. Alwin went down and the great spectre went in for the kill. But Alwin had something on his side. He had quickness. Realizing what happened, he got up, he took his sword and lopped the head off the spectre. The head fell to the ground, but the spectre stood. Knocking his head off didn't stop him. The spectre grabbed his sword and straight through the leg of Alwin. Alwin went down, the spectre coming in for a final blow. But Alwin, his blade at the ready, pushed it through the heart of the spectre, who finally fell to the ground. Alwin sat there for who knows how long, gathering his breath. The great horse of the spectre still standing, breathing this smoke. Back in those days, when you defeated another knight, you took the horse as trophy. He took the great horse, and his page and Alwin's page took Alwin's horse. His page helped Alwin onto his own horse, bandaged his leg up as best they could, and they turned around and the spectre was gone. So they led the great horse back to the hall, and they told the Lord that they'd been victorious. And a great celebration was held. The best doctors came to help with Alwin's leg. And after weeks of celebrating and Alwin getting his strength back, they left. And over the coming months, the story got told far and wide. And Alwin's leg started to heal. Eventually, it was as good as new. It was almost a year later. And the only remaining thing that Alwin had was this great horse that was now, in the light of day, seemed like nothing more than a large thoroughbred horse. He put down the breathing of smoke to the chill night air. And of course that knight didn't get up and stab him in the leg after he'd taken his head off. It must have been a mistake. Maybe he just knocked off his helmet. Maybe the body had just fallen down the hill. There's no way that happened. And it came 12 months later, and all of a sudden, the wound that had been completely healed burst open. And the whinnying from the stables grew louder. Alwin grabbed his page, and his page took him down into the stables, and there was the horse, breathing steam again. But no sign of the spectre. And so the physicians came and they fixed the wound once again. Almost a year went by and his leg was almost healed. The horse that seemed so daunting a year ago was again nothing more than a normal black thoroughbred horse. It must have been a coincidence. He must have done something because it still was weak. It's always going to be weak. And a year went by, and on the anniversary of that battle, the wound split open again. The whinnying started. The horse breathed steam. Each time this happened, the pain was excruciating. And each time it was worse and worse and worse. Until finally he could take it no more. So finally, once the leg had healed, he and his page and the horse came back to the island. They went back to the Five Barrows. And they went up there and they waited. But of course nothing happened. But he had set his mind to it. So he pledged himself for the rest of the season to the Lord of Carisbrooke. On the eve of the last battle, he went back up to Carisbrooke, up to Five Barrows. And there, when the sun started to come down, above him, on the very last hillock, he saw the spectre. The spectre bowed. Alwin bowed. The great horse reared up and ran to its master, and off they went. But that's not the only part of the story. You see, the king had a very tumultuous reign, and a chap from France thought that he should be king. Guillaume de Bastère. Have you ever heard of him? William the Bastard, that's right. Who lately we call William the Conqueror. Alwin lost his life at the Battle of Hastings. And they say that he's actually on the Bay Tapestry. I don't know where, but I like to think this dude just behind Harold getting stuck in the eye is our friend Alwin the Lame. That's the story. That's the longest story. So the rest from now are getting quite quick. Let me take a quick drink. I don't want to be fainting on you as well. Whew. If anyone needs to go to the loo or anything, now's the time to go. Right. Shalfleet hanging tree. What's unusual about Shalfleet? I've already said it up there, didn't I? The church lacked a name until the 1960s. No one knew who it was dedicated to. How bizarre is that, right? Look it up, it's true. This is not one of these tall stories, but no one knows who it was dedicated to. It's also a weird place. Ever walked around there at night? It's a weird old place. Quiet and mysterious. All around there is a bit wonky, isn't it? It's now dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel, and that happened in 1964. Remember that date, 1964. Really important. So here's the story of how they forgot the name of the church and why we have the hanging tree. That is not the original hanging tree, I must say, but it's in the actual position. Who knows Franchville? Ever heard of Franchville? Anyone? Newtown. Before it was called Newtown, it was called Franchville. It was renowned for their gold making skills, their silver making skills. In fact, some of the roads there are still named after it. Silver Street, Gold Street. But of course, with great wealth, attracted rats. But that's another story. One day, well, I've covered it before, the Pied Piper of Franchville. We've all heard that story? Yeah, we're not talking about that. But also, what happens when you have a place with lots of gold and silver? What else does it attract? Criminals, crime, and a lot of it. And as we all know, that's a weird place around there as well, isn't it? Go drive around there at night and tell me it's not the weirdest place you've ever been. But smugglers and all sorts liked it around there, and it was swampy and it was all a bit marshy. But if you have a look, go on Google Maps and put the satellite imaging on there and have a look, you can see how big Franchville was big. It was huge. It was a proper town. Proper town. Anyway, it attracted a lot of horrible people. And because the people of Franceville, they kind of didn't like having to deal with criminals, they basically sentenced if you're caught stealing, sent to death, hanging, you're done. It was quite common in England at the time anyway. But then they had a problem. They kind of had to do the dirty work. And I think if anyone knows the story of the Pied Piper, they were a lazy bunch. So the people of Shalfleet had the reputation of being a bit louche, a bit fast and loose with things. And they were kind of okay with taking a little bit of a stipend from their rich cousins over in Franceville, and they would happily deal with the criminals. And so there was a tree just outside, as you can see. You can see in the background there, you can see the churchyard. There was a tree just outside the churchyard, a big old tree. I thought, this is perfect. And that's where they'd string people up. Now, after a while, the people of Shalfleet became so accustomed to death and these criminals, they just stopped taking the bodies down. They just left them there until they rotted and their heads popped off and they fought, and then they'd hope that the rats and whatever would take them away. They kind of just, it was part and parcel of the day. But there's a terrible side to that. It hardened their hearts. The death hardened the hearts of people of Shalfleet. And because it was said that not a day went by when you couldn't hear the creaking of the ropes under tension from the bodies. Could you imagine the smell? Just imagine the smell. And they've actually found the pit, a mass grave that predates the plague, just outside of Shalfleet. Just so you know that I'm not making this up. The priest of the church had had enough. Unable to touch the hearts of his flock, he left. He just left. What were the villagers to do? They kind of didn't want to go to church anyway. Death was as death is. And so life went on. Until one day, very gradually, it started with one person and then started to spread out. The dreams started. It started with the local saint who the church had been named after, warning them that what they were doing was wicked. And then the souls of the poor souls that we talked about earlier came back and haunted them in their dreams over and over till no one could sleep, warning them that their own souls were rotting inside. Till finally, the saint came to them and said, "That's it. This place will not be sanctified until no person is hanged in this land ever again." They awoke the next day. The whole village awoke. They came, they cut the tree down. They went to the next village and they begged the priest to come and give a burial to these poor souls. And then the people of the village did their best to rebuild their lives. But within a generation, they'd forgotten the name of the church. A priest came back eventually, but no one knew who it was dedicated to. In 1964, do you remember that date? Does anyone else know what happened in 1964? Yeah?
My nan was
That's not bad. That probably did happen, but actually what we're talking about was the very last person to be hanged in this country. And in 1964, the church was rededicated to St. Michael the Archangel. The other strange thing is, no matter how many times a tree has been cut down in that position, a new one has sprouted. And they say that even the branches of the new trees hang low and heavy. The weight of those poor souls. And I have not personally done it, but I have been told that you can sometimes hear that creaking, creaking, creaking from the trees. And that's the story of Shalfleet Hanging Tree. All right. The creature of Blackwater Hollow. I love this story. Who knows who Robert Hooke is? Yes?
Before you go on, could you possibly shut the door? That beep is driving me crazy.
Yes, I can do that. It's driving me nuts as well. I just didn't want anyone killing over. Right. Who knows who Robert Hooke is? One of our greatest scientists. Without his discoveries, we would not have Newtonian physics. He was also a very cranky old geezer. But he was born in Freshwater Bay. He's a wonderful son of the Isle of Wight. Born to John Hooke. But this story is not about Robert Hooke. This is about his older brother, who was also called John Hooke, who became a reverend. But not only was he a reverend, he was a collector of curiosities. So he had the same curious nature as his brother, but directed in a different direction. Very much focused on the supernatural and the otherworldly. And someone reported finding that there were some strange bones at Blackwater Hollow. And they described them to John, who couldn't believe it. So he wanted to go and see them, possibly take them, bring them home for his collection. He paid the man a few measly shillings and he took John to this place, and he found all scattered all around bones sticking up out of the ground. So he dug and dug and found some bones, and it looked like human bones. Then he found a skull. But it wasn't like a normal skull, rounded at the back like yours and mine, but a long snout, sharp teeth, like a dog's head. He dug it out and cleaned it up. He went hunting and he found the rest of the bones. And he put it in a sack. And he took them back with him. And that night, he spent the night cleaning the skull and everything up. And laid them out on the table. A full human skeleton, with a dog's head. He went to bed. Now his wife, at this time, was pregnant with his youngest daughter, Grace. And during the night, they heard a scratching at the door. His wife, sort of heavily pregnant, could hear him, woke him up, and what's that at the door? There's an animal at the door, John. John went downstairs and sort of kicked at the door. Whatever it was ran away. The next morning they got up, and on the door were deep scratches in the door. What sort of animal was that? He didn't think too much of it. Next day was just like any other. He went to the church, he preached, and they went to bed. And that night, they heard the scratching. And then they heard, oh! There hadn't been any wolves on the island in centuries. He grabbed his musket. He went downstairs, banged on the door, and whatever it was ran away. He went outside and there was nothing there. The next morning when they woke, the chickens had been slaughtered and their blood all on the path. There must be some sort of wild dog, he thought. Some wild animal. The next night, the scratching, the howling, and the bleating of sheep, and the gurgling. The next morning, their sheep were slaughtered. They were getting worried. So he went out and he got some dogs, and they'd guard the place. The next night, no scratching, no howling, except the of the dogs, and then silence, and then the door, the front of the house opening. John grabbed his wife and they went downstairs into the basement. Closed it down. They heard this scratching, walking sound. And then bang, 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 as the thing tried to open the door. And then scratching and the howling. And the next morning they got up and the bones were strewn all over the floor. But the head was gone. He gathered up the rest of the bones and he took them back and buried them as best he could. And that, they thought, was the end of that. This is where the story goes and takes a rather even worse turn for them. Grace was born in 1660. She went off to go and live. All of a sudden, they sent her off to go live with Robert in London. She was a troubled child. And John had never been the same after this incident. In fact, he took his own life in 1677. Hung himself. It's a fact, it's on record, he absolutely did. Grace ended up having an illegitimate child. Grace came back to the island at 17. She ended up having an illegitimate child with Sir Robert Holmes, who was the governor of the island, which was basically the lead on from the Lord of the Island. At 17. Now it's said that Grace told the story to Robert, and she told him that because of this there was a curse upon the family, there was a curse upon her because she was in her mother's womb when this happened. And sure enough, at 27, Grace died of smallpox. On her dying breath, she pleaded with Robert, who was married to someone else. You must remember this. She was his mistress, but she pleaded for the life of their daughter Mary, to go find those bones and lock them away somewhere and break the curse. And he did. And 17th of November, 1694, at the age of 70, because he was much older. This was not long after Grace had died. He went and found them, and he locked them away on the Hook Farm. Now they say that Mary, their daughter, went on to live into her 80s. But before she left, she carved this in the stone. And it's there today. You can go see it at St Agnes's Church. It's right there. And it says M plus Y 1694 and a 3. I don't know what it means. But they say it was Mary Holmes, who is the daughter of Grace and Sir Robert Holmes, who wrote that. Some way of maybe breaking the curse that plagued their family. And it seemed to do the job because, as I said, she lived into her 80s. I think she had 8 children, actually. All survived. And that's the story of the creature of Blackwater Hollow. The Spectre of St Mildred's. This one's a very quick story, but not a very nice one. Who knows the story? Who knows the church of St Mildred's, Whippingham? It's a beautiful church, isn't it? Absolutely crazy beautiful, isn't it? Well, this is the story, kind of how we ended up with it, really. So, Sarah Faulkner of Whippingham, daughter of William Faulkner. She was his youngest daughter. He was a blacksmith. He died when she was quite young. And of course, being the youngest, she didn't have many prospects. She fell in love with a very smart and charming older gentleman from the mainland when she was 16. He told her he was on the island to learn how to run his father's estates. They met in secret, and he told her and ensured her that one day, when the time was right, he'd get blessing from his father. He'd be down for a while and then he'd go away. And then he'd come back. He'd fool around with Sarah. And every time he would say, when the time is right, I will get blessing from my father. Eventually he said his father had fallen ill and he'd be away for much longer periods. But he would come back when he inherited his fortune and they'd be married. But he came back. In 1790, Sarah fell pregnant with this man's love child, illegitimate child. His name was never mentioned. And when he next returned, she demanded that he marry her straight away. And he turned around, I'm a man of repute, to her, and he refused. In fact, he said, that is not my child. I'm already married, he said to her. And denying the child was his, denying she had anything to do with him, he left. Sarah was rejected by her family. She had no support or help. So she turned to the vicar of St Mildred's, then a medieval church, small medieval church. The vicar was saddened by her story and took her in as a housemaid. And but he made her swear not to say anything about her condition because the parishioners wouldn't like that. But he wasn't as lovely as he sounded, so he ended up seducing Sarah, taking advantage of her in her weakened state, until she got to the point where they could no longer hide the baby, at which time he turfed her out, accused her of being a thief and a harlot, and bringing ill repute upon him and his place of worship. She was left with nothing. So she waited till that evening when he was in the church, and she set it alight. Set the church of St Mildred's alight. She then walked outside and hung herself from a yew tree. The blaze was so hot that the walls started to crumble, and one of the walls fell against the yew tree. For the next couple of weeks, people reported hearing the sobs of a woman and the cries of a baby. It took them 2 weeks to find the body, crushed behind the wall, clinging to her stillborn child who had died prematurely. And this is where the story kind of hints to who maybe this person was. The church was left in ruin for 5 years. It was considered a tainted, filthy place. Haunted, still is. The very famous architect, John Nash, mysteriously turned up and rebuilt the church 5 years later. John Nash spent the rest of his days in East Cowes and around that area for no apparent reason. Was it John Nash? I don't know. But it certainly seems mysterious. But, like with all these things, people have reported hearing a baby crying, a woman weeping, and the smell of acrid, burning flesh. Now, some people say, no, that's nothing more than the wind blowing up from the Medina. But you tell me. And all these facts are true. You can look them up in all the records. And that's the Spectre of St Mildred's. So without this horrible story, we may not have got what is this amazing church that we have now. The very last story. This one's a really quick one, and then we'll be done. This is the Gatten Horse. Who's heard of the Gatten Horse? No. Many years ago, there was a huge population of wild ponies on the island. There still are some around Ventnor. You know about the wild ponies? Who has heard of the wooden horse, or the wooden horse that from Kent? They'll like, yeah. They say it actually originated here from the wild ponies. And the story goes right back to, who's heard of Hengist and Horsa? Yeah? Hengist and Horsa were the first Jutish rulers. And Horsa came to visit the island, to visit his cousins, the other Jutis here, and met a horse which was said to be the incarnation of Woden, the god Woden. But that's not the story we're having today. But that's just to give you some background. These horses were everywhere on the island. Come the 19th century, what changed? Does anyone know? Who came to the island and changed it forever? Queen Victoria. With the advent of Queen Victoria, the gentrification came to the island and the magic started to leak away. And as part of that, they got rid of the horses. they tried to break them. And those they couldn't break, they would kill or ship off to be food. And they systematically came through. And there was one place left. Who knows where Gatten is? Huh? What you think of as Shanklin now is the old village of Gatten. Shanklin was down the hill. The reason it became Shanklin is the reason for this tale of this ghost horse. They brought in the railways. And old Shanklin was way out of the way. They couldn't go like that. So they put the station in Gatten. And they called it Shanklin Station. Now, incidentally, and this goes back to why, again, islanders kind of cling on to the things that they do. Everywhere else in the mainland, whenever they put in a train station, because they wouldn't put them in the centre of towns because it didn't fit, the towns would shift and move to where the stations were. What did we do on the island? We kind of ignored it, stayed where we were, and we had these stations in these weird places that were never anywhere near the towns that they were supposed to be. And no one used them, but except for Shanklin, because there was an established town there, or a village, Gatten. And the last vestiges of this side of of St Boniface Down, of the wild horse or the wild ponies, was here in Gatten and Lake. And they were causing havoc. They couldn't have them just walking through the train lines because trains had hit them. They'd get into things and they'd ruin their supplies. And they kept pushing them closer and closer into Gatten till finally there was just a small colony left. And they did what they always did. They broke the ones they could break. The ones they couldn't break, they just kill or ship off until finally one was left, the fastest and the biggest of all the horses. And they couldn't get him, no matter how hard they tried. Until one morning they decided that they were going to come out and they were going to get behind the horse and they were going to trap him up against the cliffs. They would grab the horse there. And they did that. And the horse stood there in the mist, in that cold, misty morning. And rather than be caught, the horse jumped off the edge and fell to its death. And people said they heard the screams of the horse, or the cries of the horse. But they said it was the cries of the horse being free. Now, where's the ghost part of this? At the church in Gatten, St Paul's Church, every so often, you can go up there and ask the vicar, every so often, just out of nowhere, they find horse droppings in the cemetery there, in the churchyard. Just out of nowhere. And if you go to very close to where the lift is that takes you down to the beach there, they say on some cold winter's mornings when the mist comes in, you can hear the whinnying of horses. So that's the Gatten Horse. And that's the last of our stories for tonight. Thank you.